Today I'd like to begin with the stories of four iconic companies. Here we see a horseless carriage, better known as an automobile or a car. The company I'd like to talk about is one called Studebaker Brothers. Now interestingly, Studebaker Brothers were the predominant manufacturers of horse-drawn carriages in the latter part of the 19th century in the United States. They were a highly successful company, commanding at one point 60% of the market for carriages sold in the U.S. Then, around the turn of the century, came along the automobile. Now, the Studebaker brothers made the transition from horse-drawn carriages to horseless carriages, yet they never were able to compete at the same level and with the same success that they had in the horse-drawn carriage business, eventually going bankrupt and disappearing from the American roads. Remington typewriter. Remington typewriter, during the time that Studebaker Brothers was making their transition to automobiles, was the most successful typewriter company in the world. They commanded market shares also close to 60%, and some analyses suggested that 90% of typewriters used in offices in New York City were Remington typewriters. Now, Remington had a long and successful run, many decades of success, profitability. But then eventually technology changed once again. And as you can imagine, first there were electronic typewriters and then eventually word processors. And Remington is no longer in the privileged position it had been for so many years. Sears, Roebuck and Company. Now Sears is still around. Many of you are probably familiar with them. Large retailer. They got their start as a catalog business. And for many decades, they were the preeminent retailer in the United States, having the #1 position in the retail market. And this was persistent for over 100 years. But in more recent decades, they found competition in the forms of Walmart and Target have undermined their profitability, shrunk their revenues, and while they're still in existence today, they're no longer as dominant and in such a privileged position as they had enjoyed for many decades. Even more recently, Kodak. Kodak, one of the lions of U.S. industry, market leader year in, year out in the film business. Well, you can imagine what has happened in the last 10 years. We've had a shift in technology from film-based cameras to digital cameras, and Kodak has struggled to make a transition from their traditional business in film and film processing, and just recently declared bankruptcy. So what happened in each of these cases? Now, if we recall our fundamental principle of business strategy, if everyone can do it, it's difficult to create and capture value from it. However, in each of these cases, the companies had successfully created value and captured value and had done it over long periods of time. As we talked about in last session, they had distinctive capabilities that conferred on them competitive advantage that was sustainable, once again, for a long period of time. So let me introduce what I'd like to call the first corollary to the fundamental principle. Colloquially, change is the only constant. A little more technically, over time, economic profits, or rents as we've called them, tend to dissipate as markets evolve. And that this is a common phenomenon observed in industry after industry. Success is only temporary. So we've talked about our monopoly perspective, or the industrial organization view on rents, this idea that industry structure matters and that there are barriers to entry that can allow a firm to do very well. We talked in our last session about this idea of Ricardian rents, the resource-based view, in which barriers to imitation allow firms to do well within an industry. Today we're going to focus on a third type of economic rent, sometimes referred to as Schumpeterian rents, after Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter. Now, Schumpeter was very interested in how the economy evolved over time. He looked at business cycles. He looked at the ways that economies and markets changed as they evolved. This is sometimes referred to as the dynamic capabilities view. So the dynamic capabilities perspective has a fundamental premise that markets are dynamic. To the extent we observe economic rents, it's due to temporal advantages that eventually be competed away. But success comes from timing and adaptation to get on the forefront of a market, capture those economic rents before others move in, or perhaps before technology or the market shift and takes away those economic rents.